Welcome to the lecture on scopes. So by the end of this lecture, you're going to be able to explain what scope means in JavaScript, specifically global scope, lexical scope, and you will also be able to talk about execution contexts, and you'll describe why the variables let and const are the preferred ways to define variables in JavaScript. Great, let's jump right into it. So, scope, when we talk about lexical scope, refers to where variables are defined and what variables are available in your current position in code. So if I just have a blank code editor here and I declare a variable with let, let's say the variable a equals 10. I will be able to access the variable a anywhere in my code. This would be what we would consider a global variable, because in this text editor that I have right here, it is declared in the top level scope. Okay, so variables in higher scopes are available in lower scopes. So then you're asking maybe, how do you create a new scope, or what is a lower scope? Well, for instance, a lower scope might be if you have an if statement, like if 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, not 5. If 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, then console.log a. So what we'll do is we'll say if 2 and 2 is 4, we're going to console.log a. Let's run that. Cool. We still get 10 because inside of the scope of our if statement, we have access to variables that are declared outside of it. So to show you that the opposite is not true, let's check this out. If I declare a variable here like let b equals hello from the if, b is now going to be this string, and we're declaring it inside of this if statement. Let's try to console.log b. Well, actually, first, let's console.log b inside of the if statement. Comment that out. Run it. Cool. Hello from the if. That makes sense because our if statement is true. We enter it, we declare a variable b, and we console.log it. Cool. So now, if we take out that console log and bring this one back in, this console log is outside of the if statement. So let's go ahead and see if our variable v, if our variable b, I get those mixed up, is available now. We get a reference error, b is not defined, which after thinking about scopes and where variables are available, we know that b, the variable b, is not going to be available outside of this if block. Now, here's our point that, our first point here, which is the reason why I prefer using let over the keyword var is for this reason. You saw that I changed let on line 4 to var b. And now b is available outside of my if block. And block is just defined as what's within these curly braces. So this to me is very unpredictable behavior. I don't like that my b is available outside of a block. Now, in this situation, it may not seem a big deal, like, okay, who cares? I can remember that b will be available outside of the block. That's fine, but we'll run into a lot more complicated situations where this kind of behavior, where your variable declaration will leak out into scopes, leak out into outer scopes, that could cause a problem and be unpredictable and kind of make nightmare situations with debugging. So I always prefer using let. In fact, I would say that I never use the keyword var. I know what it does, so when I see it in other people's code, it's fine, but I never ever use var in my own code. So we've got let b equals hello from the if, and we're all good. One more thing here. Let's think about scope. Where else could you create a scope? You could also create a function, and let's call our function myfunc. Great. Now we've got a function myfunc. Within our function, why don't we do the same thing? We'll put b down here. And let's just see if this still works, right? We say b is not defined. Well, this makes sense also because we haven't invoked myfunc yet. But we still get a reference error even when we invoke my function. B is not defined. Okay, so let's try one other thing here. Let's try one other thing that I think hammers home this point, or another point about scopes, which is this. If I go into myfunc and I say a is now equal to 100. Actually, let's make it really different, like 999. Okay, so within myfunc, I'm going to set a equal to a different number. So like we were saying before, variables that are declared in outer scopes, which a is on the most outer scope in this situation. There's no scope greater than this outer scope of this whole text editor here. A should be available within myfunc, so we should be able to actually console log what a is. Let's see if that works. Let's take away this console log for a second. So within our function, when we invoke it, a has the value of 10. That's great. That's what we expect. We expect a to have the value of 10. We haven't changed it yet. I commented that out. So now let's run a little experiment here. And now I reassign a to be the value of 999. So let's actually console log reassign. Let's console log what happens after I reassign the value of a. So, and this is a great thing to do with console logs, is add a little string telling you what your console log is doing, or maybe even where it is in your code, and then add your actual variable. So let's run this and see what happens. What do you expect to happen? Well, b isn't doing anything right now. We're just assigning a variable, but I expect to see a console log of a, which is 10, but then a is reassigned to be 999. So I console log again a after the reassign, and you know what? I expect now a to be changed. So let's see what happens. Cool. We've got 10 from our first console log, and we've got after reassign for our second console log to be 999. That makes sense. You can reassign variables, and that's no problem, right? But let's do one step further here. What happens if I console log a here? What if I console log a outside of my function? Do we expect a to be 10 or 999? Because this is the a equals 10 is in the outer scope, which makes sense that we can we have access to a within the inner scope of the function. But what do we expect to see now with console log of a? Let's find out. I'm going to console log, and I'm going to name this too. Let's say from function scope. Cool. Let's try it. Ah, interesting. So when I invoke my function, the value of a is 10, which makes sense because we declared it outside of the function in an outer scope. Then I set inside the function, I set a to be reassigned the value of 999. When I console log a again, after I run my function, a has been reassigned to be 999. So this is maybe behavior that is not expected, or maybe you did expect it, maybe you knew it, that that's how it would happen. But basically the point here is that when you have a variable available within inner scopes, you can reassign it different values, you can change its value, and that value will be changed in the outer scope as well. All right, so this is actually not a bad example to talk about. Maybe if you're wondering what the difference between let and the keyword const is. Just a really quick point here. If we set the value of a to be equal to 10 with const. So const is just short for constant, and we'll see what constant does here in a second. We're invoking the function, myfunc. Once again, B still isn't doing anything. I mean, I could take this line of code out. In fact, maybe this would even be better if we commented it out. Maybe not. We console log from the function scope, and then we reassign A, and then finally, outside of the function, when we're done, we invoke console log, but just so we can see the value of A. So let's just say from global scope. I should have just done that from the beginning. Cool. So now we're going to see the value of A from the global scope. Let's try this. Interesting. So inside of our function, we console log it, and we get the value we expect because we assigned it as 10. But then on line 6, when we try to reassign A to be 999, we get an error because we're trying to reassign a variable that we declared as constant. So this demonstrates what the keyword const does. It basically says, hey, I'm going to make a variable A, and I will never reassign the value of A. That is what const does. So when you're making a variable that you know you're never ever going to change it, it might be a good idea to declare it as a constant. Because then, if for some reason you forget or somebody else forgets and tries to reassign it within a function or within an inner scope, or actually even in an outer scope, you'll get an error. It's kind of like a little safety check. You'll get an error that says, hey, you said that's a constant variable. Don't reassign it. All right, so that's when you would use const. Obviously, or maybe not obviously actually, if you want to do something like this, if you want to say A equals A plus, A plus 5, so if we wanted A to be 15 instead of 10 within this function, and we want to console log A as 15, if you want to do something like that, you don't want to use const as your keyword. So we would change this back to let. So if you need to change your value, mainly I'm thinking about this with numbers. If you need to change your number, or if you have a string and you want to add to the string. So for instance, if A were hello, and we wanted to reassign A as hello plus world, so it'll say hello world. If we want to do something like this, we want to use let, but we don't want to use const because we're going to get an error. One thing that is a little bit confusing, I think, with people with const is that if you declare, so this was with strings and numbers with const. If you declare an object or an array with const, So let's say const a equals this empty array, and then in my function, I actually want to do a, not a equals, but if I want to do a push, why don't we just call this value from my function? If I want to push to my array, it's a common misconception that this will be a problem with your constant, because we're actually not changing the value of our array. Our array is the same array in memory. We're just pushing a value inside of it. So it doesn't actually change the value of the array. Let's see what happens here. Okay, interesting. So when I console log a at first inside the function, it's an empty array, right? Because I haven't pushed anything yet. But now I push something, which is just one string. And now you can see that from the global scope, after my function is run, a has this value in it, and there was no error thrown because I'm not changing the value of the array. However, what if I were to do something like this? A equals this array with a value from my function. So basically the same string, right? But I just enclose it in some array brackets. And I mean, look, that's kind of what we think. That's kind of what we think we're doing, right? Like we have an empty array, and then now we're saying, hey, I want you to equal this. We'll get an error here, because whenever this is a very important point, but whenever you declare an array, this is called an array literal when you type these brackets. This is you can just treat this as basically saying like, hey, I want to create a new array in memory. This is a new array, and it is different. It is a different array in memory than the one that we declared on line 1. So you could say like, hey, this is super simplified and not at all what actually happens, but it's good for the concept. You could say that maybe this array on line 1, let's say this is mapped to address in memory 500. It's, if you want to look for this array, it's in memory slot 500. On line 6, when you use these brackets, this is saying to JavaScript, hey, I want you to make a new array, and that array is going to have a string inside of it. But that new array, let's just say that it's in memory slot 851. So what JavaScript says is, hey, when we're looking at memory slot 500, this is not the same memory slot. We can't reassign a constant variable. That is the same actually for objects, where you can't reassign an object, but you could do something like this. If a is an object, you could do a dot greeting equals, actually forgot what my greeting was. Let's just say hello world. If we assign a property here to this object, a lot of people maybe commonly misconstrue this as thinking that this will throw an error. But let's see what happens. Now we have an empty object when it first happens in our function. But from the global scope, you can see that our object now has a greeting property with a string of hello world. So we're actually not changing the object itself. We're not changing the object in memory. This is still at memory slot, I don't know, 751. I just made that up. 751. And we're just adding a property to that object at memory slot 751. So that's why we can't do something like this, because this is saying, hey, create a new object in memory at memory slot 10,000,005. And this looks like the same object that we're expecting down here. Greeting, hello world, greeting, hello world. It looks like the same thing, but what if we do this? We get an error because we're trying to reassign the value of this object. This is a totally different object in memory when you type these curly braces. Curly brackets? Curly braces? What's the correct term for these? That's something I'll look up later. Okay. Finally, this is not a bad place to discuss what execution context is. Execution context is, let's just actually write that up here. Execution context. Execution context is not a phrase that you're going to use very often in your career working with computers and software, but it is a concept that you will understand, and maybe you already understand it, but it's a concept that is important. You just won't talk about execution contexts very much. But now you're going to be able to talk about execution context and explain what in the world this even means. It looks like a scary phrase, but it's really not. Let's talk about exactly what it is. So let's go back here and say A is hello. And then what do we want to do? I'm going to go back to my let's. I'm going to take away all this fancy object stuff. I'm going to say hello from inner. Let's say hello from function scope. Hello from, we already do hello from global scope. This may be, all of the hellos might get a little bit confusing, and if that happens, then we'll just need to change this. Let's not use const, we want to use let. What is execution context? The really short moral of the story here with execution context is it just means that whenever you invoke a function, a new execution context is created. Whenever you invoke a function, a new execution context is created. Basically, the execution context tells you what variables are available at a certain time when you invoke a function. And since a context is created every single time you invoke a function, your variables might be different depending on where you invoke it. So for instance, I think actually we don't worry about this global scope anymore, but I've got my func being invoked down here. And within my func, I'm reassigning the value of a, which is fine because we use the let keyword. Let's move this console log down here from function scope. Okay, how about after reassignment? So execution context means when we get down to this line on line 12. By the way, what does that mean when I get down to this line? Well, in order to start talking about execution contexts, let's just say that when JavaScript first sees your code, when you first run your code, when I click this run button, or when the browser runs your code, JavaScript scans your code line by line, and it assigns values to variables. So like it says, hey, we've got a variable a, and it has a value of a string hello. Hey, we've got a variable of my func, which by the way, maybe that's a little weird, but my func is actually a variable here. We might have to let that sink in, but my func, when I declare it as a function name, it becomes a variable with the value of everything that's inside the curly brackets. So it says, great. Once it sees my func, once the JavaScript engine sees that, it actually skips everything that's inside. I mean, it assigns that value, but it skips this function definition. And you'll see what I mean by that in a second. But we get down here to my func on line 12, and when the JavaScript engine sees my func with these two parentheses, it knows that it needs to run this function, which I call invoke. Run a function, execute a function, invoke a function. They all mean the same thing. I just use the word invoke because I think it's demonstrative of what happens. So we know that we're going to invoke myfunc. Immediately what happens here is the JavaScript engine jumps up to the code to wherever myfunc was defined. And now, in this execution context, like we said, this is a new execution context is created every time you invoke a function. So now a new execution context is created. And in this execution context, this is the important point. The variable A is assigned the value, or not assigned, but it has the value of hello. That's what an execution context is. We're basically saying that the variable A and every other variable that is available within this function scope at this point in time is kind of like set up and is ready for this function to use. So within myfunc, I declare a variable B, and then finally I reassign A to be hello from the function scope. So that makes sense. We're able to reassign A. We've already talked about why we can reassign it. But here's the point about execution contexts. Let's go ahead and do something here. Let's actually just console log A. Let's say we'll console log, let's call it context. Context here. So now I'm going to take this console log. I'm going to move it before we reassign it. And in fact, I don't even think we need to worry about this reassignment. And you know what? Let's not even worry about the variable B. Let's make this really, really simple. So our context here, let's look at our context. The context here is we've got hello as A. The variable A has a context, has a value of the string hello. That's if I invoke myfunc on line 10. However, if I go down here in the global scope and I say A is equal to goodbye, and I like the multiple E's. So if I assign A to goodbye here, do we expect that the A that is console logged on line 7 of myfunc to be changed? Well, remember, JavaScript scans from the beginning. All right, it sees a comment, it does nothing. It assigns A the value of hello. It sees myfunc, it's a function definition. We just skip over all of this. Now we see, oh, we're invoking myfunc. Okay, now I got to go back up to the definition. Where is it? Here it is. It's on line 5. All right, there's a comment. By the way, you notice that when I go in and I'm looking at this new execution context, I'm doing the exact same thing that I did at the very beginning, which is I scan line by line, meaning there could be multiple functions in here, like function, inner function. So this could happen as well, but we're not going to get here right now. So we scan line by line and we say, hey, we're actually invoking console log. You know it's invoking because of these two parentheses, the invocation parentheses. And we're invoking context here, which is A. And what is A? Well, A is hello. We haven't gotten to goodbye yet. So the context at this point in time on line 10, A is hello. Now, my text editor here prints out goodbye because it just prints out something if I reassign it, but that's not coming from my function. However, what happens if I invoke myfunc again down here? Well, at this point in time, I need to delete this comment because A doesn't have the value of hello. We'll know what this specific execution context has when we invoke myfunc. So let's try it. Let's see what happens. There you go. Remember, let's ignore line 11 because this is just my text editor printing this out for my convenience. In our purposes, this is not convenient right now. It's confusing. But when I first invoke myfunc, the execution context here is saying that A is equal to hello. But after I invoke my function and JavaScript exits this definition, it exits executing, invoking this function, it now sees that A has a value of goodbye. It's reassigned. We invoke myfunc again, a new execution context is created, and we console log what A is. And look, I mean, if you're not paying attention, you might go, oh, A is hello. But within this execution context on line 13, we had reassigned A to be goodbye, and we console log that context. Oh my gosh, that was a lot of information. So execution contexts and scopes, which, by the way, we have a global scope that encloses everything. We have a lexical scope. That's another fancy word. Oh my gosh, lexical. I don't think I said this word earlier. Maybe I should have. Lexical scope literally just means where physically the variables are, where things are in your code. So like, for instance, my console log lexically is within my func. A lexically is in the global scope. It's where things are. It's like, are they in a block? Are they in a block within a block? That's all lexical scope means. We talked about lexical scope. We talked about global scope. We talked about how variables have access to higher scopes, but higher scopes do not have access to variables that are defined within inner scopes, like let b equals inner scope. If we try to console log b, we're going to get a reference error. B is not defined. So we talked about lexical scope. We talked about execution context, which is literally just every time a function is invoked, a new execution context is created, and JavaScript goes through that context, not context, it goes through the code in your function line by line, and whenever it sees a function, it invokes it and creates a new execution context. Different execution contexts can have different values, and that's a very important point. So you just need to look through your code very carefully and make sure you really know what the value of variables is at a certain time in a certain execution context, because the variable A here, it doesn't always have the value of hello. We end up reassigning it, so in the execution context of line 16, the variable A has a value of goodbye, which is what I'm going to say right now to you. Thank you for watching this lecture on global scope, lexical scope, and execution context. Goodbye.